Well, you didn't show up expecting that to happen in worship, I'm guessing, now did you? These brilliant musicians, I'm going to still cry again, Jennifer. These brilliant musicians learned that in a week. Maybe less. Maybe only 3 or 4 days. Thank you for doing that. Thank you. I am grateful. For those of you who maybe live in a box, I'm not sure, but that song was the theme song from the movie Selma. It won Best Original Song at both the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes. And I asked our guests to sing it this morning for a couple reasons. One is it's Black History Month. We're going to have our More Squared race relations conversation after this. And this song definitely engages a conversation around race. But I was remembering also in relationship to the scripture this morning, I was remembering hearing that song at the Oscars last year about this time. We were sitting in our living room in Los Angeles where this song was being performed live just a couple of miles away. And seeing them perform this, hearing that even on television, which is usually not a great substitute for live music, when it was over, I was speechless. I had tears. It was beautiful, and it was powerful, and it was glory. And encounters of glory often do that to you. They leave you that way, a little speechless, just like the disciples in our story this morning. In moments of glory, you have to be awake so that you don't miss it. You have to show up and be present, and there's nothing to say. You just have to be fully present and listen. And oftentimes, many of us are not very good at that. It's sort of like our scripture that we have this morning. This scripture that is the disciples' encounter with glory, one in which the disciples were just challenged to show up. I love the disciples. I love stories about the disciples. Often I challenge us to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and I will always do that. But let's be real, sometimes it's hard to believe that that's really real for us to do because, well, Jesus is Jesus, and we are not. But here, in this story about the disciples, I am continually grateful for this mess of guys that Jesus called to be his partners and ministry and his best friends. These fool guys give me hope. These guys are real. Now, somewhere I'm hopeful there's a bunch of, there's more of the women in the story and they're paying closer attention and they're getting this, but the Gospels don't tell us that, right? In this story, we get these fool guys. I relate to them because much of the time they want to get it. They really do. They want to try so hard, Jesus, but then they fall asleep. Love their hearts. And they give me hope because if Jesus can choose this ragtag mess of fellas to do his work and to have encounters, then surely there's a place for us as well. In this passage, we get the three amigos of Jesus' posse, Peter, James, and John. And it seems to me that these guys had a reputation which preceded them. This is not the only place in the Gospels where we find these three falling asleep on the job. You may be more familiar with in Matthew's Gospel where they fall asleep. It's a story during Holy Week where they fall asleep while Jesus is trying to pray. Jesus says, 1 hour? Can't y'all just stay awake 1 hour? But here, Luke has them trying to fall asleep during a trip with Jesus up this mountain. And their nap nearly caused them to miss this encounter of glory with Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And if you have read our Richard Rohr devotional this morning, you know that he says these sleepy men are about to be awakened. And so I'm wondering if our encounter this week might be challenging us to stay awake long enough to see the glory moments in our lives. What did they sing a minute ago? The coming of the Lord, mine eyes have seen the glory. Well, your eyes have to be open. This story in Luke often gets described as a mountaintop experience where you have to go back down the mountain to do some work. And certainly there is work to do, both for the disciples as well as for us today. There is plenty of work to do, but there is no work assignment here in Luke's gospel. There is no call to action out of that cloud of glory. And the disciples kept silent and told no one. It seems to me that this moment of glory isn't about being inspired to action or service or to work, which is why Peter, poor fool, embarrasses himself. I love how Gene Peterson paraphrases when he says Peter goes to babbling, not knowing what he was doing, to try to save this moment. I saw some of you with your recorders trying to save that moment. It's not the same, right? It's not the same. You had to be present to hear them saying that. Peter wanted to hold on to it, to build a monument to it. Let me do something, guys. Come on, fellas, let's build us a couple of houses for Jesus. Let's hold on to this moment. But moments of glory come and are gone. And building the monument wasn't even what it's about. This encounter of glory is about being present and listening. Peter's carrying on about his service project, and God shows up and says, hold up. Last week, we heard God say to Jesus, you are my son, my beloved. And this week, God shows up for an encounter with the disciples to say, this is my son, listen to him. And sometimes we get confused in this story. Sometimes we get confused that God says, follow him. That God says, do what he tells you to do. Not in this moment. God just says, shut up and listen. Because sometimes it's just enough to be present and fully awake and listen. Almost 10 years ago now, there was a story in the Washington Post, and some of you may know this story. There was a little experiment done outside the subway station in Washington, D.C. And this little experiment was set up by some guys at the Washington Post. And they set up this white guy in jeans and a t-shirt and a baseball cap with a violin. And they set him up just outside, just at the top of the escalator, where you couldn't miss him as you came up from the subway to get off. And unbeknownst to the 1,097 commuters, that street musician was Joshua Bell. Anybody know Joshua Bell? There's a few musicians over here nodding their head. Joshua Bell is only, well, arguably one of the finest violinists on the planet. 3 days prior to helping pull off this little stunt, he performed to a full house at Boston Symphony Hall. And in this little stunt, just to add to the fun, Joshua Bell played his personal Stradivarius that some suggest he paid approximately $3 million for. He played a $3 million fiddle in the subway, y'all. Now, he played for 43 minutes. He played some of the most beautiful, most difficult music ever written. He started with Bach's Chaconne, maybe one of the most difficult pieces ever written for solo violin. Some people argue there are only a handful of people in the world who can play that very well. And during that time, it took 3 minutes before anybody even stopped to turn their head, but kept moving. It was 7 full minutes into Bach's Chaconne before somebody actually stopped to listen to Joshua Bell playing his $3 million violin. That day, Joshua Bell made $32 and change. Y'all would make more than that if we set a fiddle box here in front of this table. Y'all would get more than $32 and change. And one of those was a 20 that was thrown in at the last minute by a woman who knew who was playing. Seven people stopped. The vast majority went racing by, totally oblivious, completely awake, yet utterly asleep to what was happening all around them. Now, this article goes on to quote one of the curators at the National Gallery, who reminded the article's readers that in these situations, context matters. And I would agree. One doesn't expect to hear Joshua Bell outside the DC Metro station. Just like most of you didn't show up to worship this morning, expect to hear Common and John Legend. Just like the disciples didn't expect anything great, grand, or glorious to happen on this little prayer walk out with Jesus. But for me, at least, that's when encounters of glory tend to happen. Some of the greatest moments happen when you're half asleep and not expecting them at all, and that's why it is important to be fully awake. Our Buddhist friends are really good at helping to remind us of that. Thich Nhat Hanh has a breath prayer that has become so important to me. Breathe in, present moment. Breathe out, wonderful moment. Present moment, wonderful moment. But how many of us miss the present wonderful moments because we're hurrying off for whatever it is that we have to do? And we miss our lives. Now, the article doesn't let us off for simply being lazy. The article doesn't let us off for being sleepyheads or unsophisticated fools who can't appreciate a world-class musician. The author challenges us. The author challenges our priorities and our busyness. You know, I think many of us, myself included, we are doers. We are worker bees. We are smart, talented people trying to do a little good and make a difference in the world, and so we got stuff to do. Go, go, go. But as the author of this Washington Post article says, and I quote, if we can't take the time out of our lives to stay a moment and listen, to one of the best musicians on earth, play some of the best music ever written, if the surge of modern life so overpowers us that we are deaf and blind to something like that, then what else are we missing? Friends, as we continue on our Lenten journey, my prayer for us is that we will not hurry through our days half asleep and miss our life. I pray that we will make space in the midst of all of the busyness for moments of sheer beauty and glory. No agenda, no work, no call to action. Just be present and listen. I was reminded yesterday in my inbox of a prayer by the great Sufi mystic Rumi. I love Rumi. Observe the wonders as they occur around you. Don't claim them, Peter. Feel the artistry moving through and be silent. Observe. Feel. Be silent. Sounds like a good Lenten discipline, if you ask me. Observe. Feel. Be silent. Because an encounter of glory just might happen. And those are moments you can't describe, you can't explain, you can't replicate. You can only observe and feel. So my friends, my prayer for you is today that you won't miss them, because they are too good to miss. Or, as the great Duke Ellington says, they're too good to title, too. Too good to title. May it be so. May it be so for us.